at least Jake thinks he'll be with the team in the fall. Because why would he stick around? Like, it's in Jake's best interest that if they are going to part ways, it would happen sooner rather than later. Jake needs to move on if he's getting kicked off the team. And if he feels like that's going to happen, there's no reason for him to even go to practice or stick around campus at all. Hello and welcome to the Loyal Cougars podcast. I'm your host, Jake Edmonds, alongside Tosh, Mackintosh, today to talk about some BYU football news as well as the upcoming season. Tosh, how was your Father's Day weekend?
It was great. My kids are always nice to me. They were especially nice to me yesterday, and that always feels good.
Were they nice to you for no particular reason, or were they prompted by their mother? Because my kids aren't really old enough to fully understand the concept of Father's Day other than kind of what their mom tells them, which I still appreciate, but
no, the big difference is that I used to never take naps. Now that I'm 40 years old now, and something's changed where every Sunday my body wants a nap. But on a typical Sunday, I'm getting woken up left and right. Father's Day, they just gave me space, took a nice hour-long nap, and that's actually the biggest thing that stands out. That something was different is that, and I don't know if it was my wife or them, but they were much more cautious of, hey, let's dad take a real nap.
The best gift a father can receive on Father's Day is a Father's Day Sunday nap. I actually got this hat. For those that are listening and not watching, it's a wooden grail hat. It says Brigham across the top. The A is upside down, which is still apparently a style that some letters on hats are upside down. We went to Payson Lakes. We went camping over the weekend. Kind of our go-to camping spot is at Payson Lakes. We spent some time at the lake and went paddleboarding and just had a good weekend. It was fun.
Nice.
All right, so as you know by now, if you've listened to this show, this is a podcast that talks about what the fans are talking about. And the fans are still, we're months into this, and Jake Retzlaff still seems to be a pretty talked about topic, at least in terms of our show. Our shows where we talk about Jake tends to get the most engagement. And there's not a whole lot of news officially coming out from BYU and from Jake, and we've talked about this. When there's no news, the longer we go without news, it feels like the more likely he is to stay at BYU. And just to add fuel to the fire, Tosh, some investigative work going on Cougar Board when BYU posted a video of kind of their football practice going on in the summer. And it wasn't even like front and center, but Jake was in the video.
Yeah. So he's still doing strength and conditioning with the team, and so
yeah,
that means something. They haven't parted ways yet.
Yeah, and it's been confirmed by people in the know, at least to me, that he is at practice. But we saw video of, and it wasn't, again, he was in the background. He was kind of, there was a little bit of motion blur, but if you zoomed in and took a freeze frame of a very specific spot in the video, it was Jake. It was 100% Jake. So
the other thing on Cougar Board that people are mentioning is that he's playing on BYU football does some intramural teams. Like they have a softball team that's made up of entirely football players, and he's on that team too. So he's still in multiple ways part of the football team. And the quarterback position is the most important position on the field. And the fact that we don't know if our returning, senior is going to be there or not means, of course, we're grabbing every little bit of information we can that gives us any hint, will we have Jake Retzlaff this next year?
Yeah, and you can read too much into stuff like this. I think the more we go without any official news, the more we're going to read into things like this. But it's so easy as a fan to look at an incident like this where he's with the team playing softball, or he's with the team making other team appearances, or he's literally at practice with the team. It's actually hard to look at something like that and not think at least Jake thinks he'll be with the team in the fall. Because why would he stick around? It's in Jake's best interest, and to be honest, it's in BYU's best interest that if they are going to part ways, it would happen sooner rather than later. Jake needs to move on if he's getting kicked off the team, and if he's feels like that's going to happen, there's no reason for him to even go to practice or stick around campus at all. So the fact that he's at practice and making appearances with the teams tells me that he still thinks there's a good chance, at least somewhat of a chance, that he's going to be around in the fall.
Yeah, this is not in any way from an inside source. This is purely from me reading the tea leaves in the mind of Tosh. I think the most likely outcome right now is that he has some sort of suspension, 4 game suspension, plays out the rest of the year. Like, if I'm setting the odds right now, I think that's the most likely outcome with what I can figure out on June 16th.
This episode is brought to you by Aptiv. Aptiv believes that every home should be enjoyed. They tailor their pest control treatment plans to target pests when and where they're most active. Plus, if you see pest activity between treatments, Aptiv will return to take care of the problem at no additional cost. It's their way of making sure every customer is satisfied and every pest is controlled. If pests stay away, Aptiv is why. Visit AptivPestControl.com/loyalcougars or call 844-966-4787. Mention this promotion to get your initial treatment for just $29. That's AptivPestControl.com/loyalcougars or call 844-966-4787. Terms and conditions apply. Get home field advantage with Aptiv. Looking to get your brand in front of BYU's most engaged fans? The Loyal Cougars podcast and Cougar Board are your perfect match. Cougar Board is the largest online community of BYU fans with thousands of posts every day. The Loyal Cougars podcast is the official podcast of Cougar Board, and we have sponsorship opportunities available for both the podcast and the site. Contact us at sponsorships@loyalcougars.com, and we'll help your message hit home with the Cougar faithful. Again, that's sponsorships@loyalcougars.com. All right, we've already talked about who could potentially replace Jake if he does leave. And the 3 options we had were Hillstead, Bear Bachmeyer, and Trayson Bourget. And I think we've narrowed that down to probably 2. I think it's either between Hillstead or Bear Bachmeyer. But, from what you and I have heard, Kalani is very high on Bear Bachmeyer. And I think you and I talked about, like, Bear probably has the best NFL potential, the best potential on the team. He has the size, we've seen his arm. He's just young. But Kalani seems to be, based on what you and I have heard, Kalani seems to be very bullish on Bear Bachmeyer.
It seems like Kalani is telling people, hey, thank goodness we got Bear. And that, so to me, it means that they're thinking if it's not Jake, it's Bear. Also, what I didn't fully realize until recently, and I've heard this from a few different people, is that Bear Bachmeyer actually won the number 1 position in Stanford spring camp. And then they fired the coach, and then he decided to leave. And so he's maybe even better than a typical 4-star true freshman in that he's already proven that at a different program he should be the starter at this level. So he's in the lead right now if it's not Jake.
Yeah, and honestly, even if Jake is suspended for 3 or 4 games, like Bear can step in. I think it will be Bear week 1 against Portland State, and it's kind of, and we'll talk about the out-of-conference games. We're actually going to do a game preview of each game this season. We're going to do all the out-of-conference games today, and then we'll get into the conference games throughout the rest of the offseason, and I think I've timed it out right so that we'll cover every game once a week. Until week 1 of the regular season, and then we'll start talking about the season as we go. So that kind of leads us then into week 1 against Portland State. I don't think there's a whole lot to talk about with Portland State. BYU is 18-0 all time against FCS schools. They've never lost. And not only that, but Portland State is a bad team. So just for context, they went 3-8 last year. Washington State beat them. They scored 70 on Portland State. Weber State beat them 43-16. So I think it's fair. It's safe to say, and this would be a perfect introduction into college football for Bear Bachmeyer. I think it's safe to say BYU is going to win this game going away.
Yeah, we'll play vanilla defense, vanilla offense, and we'll still beat them by a large margin. Portland State though does bring bad memories to BYU fans of a game that we beat them, but they gave us all we could handle. Our offense sucked against them in a year we thought we were going to be good. And it really just set the tone for that whole terrible season that, hey, BYU is not good. And so hopefully this time There's no repeat of that, and we blow the doors off of Portland State, even if they have NFL caliber cornerbacks, which was the talk at that time, which was not true.
Yeah, BYU beat them 20-6 in 2017. It was Tanner Mangum, Squally Canada. It was that team that had a lot of hopes and a lot of potential after the 2016 season. And yeah, you're right. That it just laid a poor foundation for the rest of the season in a season where we had a lot of hopes. For context, they were only up 14-6 at halftime.
Yeah, it was.
So they're up a score at halftime, and then they score 6 in the fourth quarter. It was way too close for the team they were playing. I can't imagine we have the same outcome this year. Again, Portland State is a terrible team. Even for FCS standards, they're not a good team.
Other Portland State BYU thing I can think of is one of the Caressa brothers played there. I think he went to BYU for a minute, transferred to Portland State. When I think Portland State, I think those two things. One of the Caressas went there, and we had a loss in a game we beat them, where it just felt like walking out of there like, oh man, this feels like a loss, and it really set the whole tone for a bad season.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, man, I feel like we've talked way more about Portland State than I thought we were going to. So kudos to us for filling in as much time as we did talking about a team that BYU's going to beat by 30 plus. Moving on to Stanford, though. Stanford's not good either, and they're at home. This should be another cupcake of a game. Granted, they're not an FCS school, but they do have a new head coach. They fired Troy Taylor. Troy Taylor, I think, had some potential, but I don't know if he was really, lighting teams on fire with his offense. So just to give you some context on Stanford, last year they had 22 turnovers. They were 105th nationally. They were 116th in third down efficiency. They've got 6 straight seasons of 4 or fewer wins. ESPN's FPI this year has them second to last in the ACC, just ahead of Wake Forest. So they're not great, right? And then on top of that, they lose a ton of depth at quarterback. We talked about Bear Bachmeier leaving Stanford to come to BYU. He was their heir apparent at BYU. Elijah Brown is who was kind of pushing him potentially for reps. So he's going to start at quarterback. He's only got 48 attempted passes at Stanford, so he comes into his sophomore year without a ton of experience. And to be honest, he was beaten out by a freshman who had 0 reps. He had 2 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 58% completion percentage last year. And then their defense isn't good either. They've allowed 280 passing yards last year. They were 130th in the country in passing defense, just ahead of Oklahoma State, Texas Tech, and Tulsa. So they give up, at least last year, they gave up a ton of yards passing. Perfect situation for a guy like Bear Bachmeier to come in and light him up against his former team that he didn't have a single rep for, but at least did some spring ball for.
So agree with everything you said. Here's my only thing that scares me is you just only need to look at Big 12 football last year, and that with a Power 5 school, oftentimes the schools that you think are bad are not bad. You see that last year with BYU. You see that last year with Arizona State. Look how wrong they were about Utah and Oklahoma State last year. That, there are big-time recruits that go to Stanford. And if they can have a chip on their shoulder, the new coach simplifies things, that's the only way. All that being said, in Portland State, I give BYU a 99.5% chance of winning. Against Stanford, I give BYU an 80% chance of winning. And so there's still that 20. Any P5 school, I think they have a 1 in 5 chance of beating us. But we should win that game. Andrew Luck is the new GM. He's he fired their coach in a weird time, but still BYU has way too many horses coming back compared to what they do. We should get the W.
80's too high, 80's too low. I will say though that to your point, like even with Oklahoma State projected to finish high, Utah as well. They were still terrible, and BYU still almost lost to them, and they lost to a pretty bad Kansas team last year. So
correct.
You're right. Yes, if they're a P4 school, there's a higher chance for BYU to lose to that team. Stanford is borderline P4. They're probably closer to Oregon State and Washington State in terms of like NCAA status than they are a Miami or a Clemson in the same conference.
Totally. They're only in a P4 because of their academics. Like
Yes.
that people like the name and associating the name Stanford with their conference. That's why they're even at the level they are right now.
Agree. And because they had Cal too, right? It was Stanford and Cal. They were a package deal. It felt like they go to the ACC together. And so that made sense. Again, I don't consider Stanford, I think 80% is high. I would say 95% win. Again, just because they're at home, second game of the season. I believe it's a night game. I'm pretty sure all home games this year are night games, is what BYU
all of them
released.
they've announced times for so far are. Like they only announced times on half, but all of them are night.
Yeah, and I don't know if Stanford's one of them, but either way, like it's a home game. I'm not super concerned about it. So I feel like Stanford, and again, this is a perfect situation for Bear Bachmar to come in and play against the team that at least last year was not good defensively against the pass. So it's kind of the perfect 1-2 week 1, week 2 scenario for a freshman quarterback coming in that has 0 reps and didn't play any spring ball for BYU. So that said, ECU is week number 3, and this is where it gets a little interesting because ECU also is not a fantastic team, but they are coming off of a season where they made a bowl game. They were 8-5. They beat NC State in their bowl game. They were one of the best offenses in the country, especially in the latter half of the season when they brought in Caton Hauser as their quarterback. So he finished the season with 2,000 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. I think he only played half the season or started half the season, and they still finished 24th in the country at 436 yards per game with him at quarterback. They do lose their top running back in Rajai Harris, and they also turned it over a ton last year, 30 times, which was most in college football. So they are a high power, but also a low efficiency, at least high turnover offense. But they are going to put up some points. And again, I struggle. I think I've said this before. I struggle to believe that BYU does well on the road on the East Coast. We've actually seen that against ECU specifically, right? Like they struggled on the road at ECU before. And so can they kick that kind of East Coast funk that they've been in? I know they won at UCF. Like they've had good games on the East Coast recently, but I still have this kind of PTSD of them struggling. Ole Miss even, like games that they've won. Like remember Ole Miss with Kyle Van Noy? Like they've won games on the East Coast. They've just kind of struggled. I don't know if it's time zone difference, if it's jet lag, if it's altitude. Like the air is just heavier. I don't know what it is, but they tend to struggle.
I travel for work quite a bit, and I'm not even playing a sport. I feel different when I do the 2-hour thing. To me, it's the sleep. Like I get there, and I usually go to bed at midnight here in Utah. Maybe I should go to bed earlier, but that means my body's not tired until 2 a.m. there. But then things start at a normal time, so I got to have a meeting or something at 8, so I got to get up at 7, which feels like 5 a.m. in Utah, and it just compounds. I just feel groggy and tired and not the same there, and I do think, and the stats bear that out, when West teams go 2 time zones east, it really affects their ability to play, and you can see it in wins and losses. So the thing that gives me hope, ECU was a good team last year. They beat, a Power 4 school in a bowl game. That being said, the thing that ECU is fighting against, and I'm glad BYU's not in this boat anymore, is now when they have a good team, they lose a lot in the transfer portal. They lost a starting quarterback, Nash, to Michigan State. They lost another cornerback. 3 cornerbacks, actually. They had another sophomore cornerback that went to Virginia Tech this last transfer portal. They lost their safety. They lost a wide receiver. They lost a linebacker. Like they're losing key players where BYU, besides Keenan Marion, really I feel like lost depth. And some of that I think BYU told people to leave. Where these smaller schools, they lose starters because they're trying to go to bigger programs to play. And so when you factor all that in, I give BYU an 85% chance of us beating ECU. It should be a win. we should end these games 3-0 and feeling really good about the season.
Yeah, I agree. It's weird to think that that a non P4 school. We have one P4 school in our non-conference schedule, and one of the non P4 games seems to be the least likely win. But I agree. I think it's probably 80-85% chance. You put Stanford at 80, so you're probably more confident in BYU's chances against ECU. I actually think ECU is going to be the toughest non-conference game, but again, the non-conference schedule feels like a 3-0 start. And for a season where they're projected, at least Vegas odds have them. I think it's 7.5. I don't know if that's changed, but early Vegas odds had them at 7.5. Starting 3-0 is good. I don't think there's anything negative about that. Now, can they beat Portland State 20-6 again and have a poor foundation to start the season? Yeah, probably. I mean, not probably, but possibly. And so we could feel bad about a 3-0 start if it's ugly against pretty bad teams, but a 3-0 start, with a potentially with a freshman quarterback, learning a new offense, I think that could be, it should be a good sign for BYU fans.
I think our defense is too good. We have too much experience and talent on both lines. I think we're 3-0. Bad case scenario, we're 2-1. I can't fathom a place that it's worse than that.
No, it should not be. Okay, so moving on now, and we'll talk more about this as we go throughout the rest of the offseason. Next week we'll talk about their first conference game, which I think is Colorado, off the top of my head. So we'll talk about Colorado. Yes, Colorado is their first conference game at Colorado. So we'll talk about that game next week. I think that's going to be one of the most fun games to watch this season, but we'll talk more about it next week. For now, though, we've got a pretty interesting post on Cougar Board, and I love kind of the off-season fodder that fans have. But RSL on Cougar Board posted this or submitted this post that got a lot of engagement. He said, "If Brandon Davies is the number one all-time what if in BYU sports, what is number two across all BYU sports?" Can we agree that Brandon Davies is the number one what if, Tosh?
Yes, absolutely. For sure. He's in stone. That, like, we went to a Sweet 16 without him, and he was an NBA caliber center. We would have been freaking good had that not gone down the way it went down.
Yeah, and NBA is a little bit of a stretch because he played for the process.
Yeah.
But he did still play in the NBA, even if it was for a team that was tanking and intentionally losing.
And he dominated the level under that. Like, when he's gone to Europe and played at the highest level over there, he's been an all-star multiple times. He's dominated. So I agree. He's a fringe NBA player, but I don't think that it's unfair to call him an NBA player.
Sure. Bottom line, he was a top 3 contributor on a team that made it to the Sweet 16 without him, right? You add him back into the lineup, they're beating Florida, right? They lost to Florida in overtime. So he makes up the difference of that game. And then who they have left, I think that's the biggest what if in all of this is who was left on the schedule. It was Butler and VCU. And Butler with Gordon Hayward, it's not a easy team to beat in Butler, but I don't know, man. I much rather would have played Butler than Florida that year. I think Butler was a more winnable game. I think VCU was a more winnable game that year than Florida. And then you play Duke, right? Then it's you have a lights out game against Duke in the national championship, and you give yourself a chance. And that's probably the biggest what if for me is not only would they have beaten Florida, but then the remaining path to a championship, at least a championship appearance, was so easily attainable, compared, relatively easily attainable, compared to, past and NCAA tournaments.
It's one of those things that every BYU fan that was a fan at that time knows where they were when they heard that news. The Jimmer mania was at such a level, and that was such a brutal blow that we were better than the New Mexicos and the San Diego States with him. And we were kind of on par with those guys without him. So
the consensus number 2 what if behind Brandon Davies is at least on Cougar board, is Taysom staying healthy. And this is in multiple seasons, right? He got hurt, I think, 3 seasons, season-ending injury. I do think, though, the 2016 season was probably the one that hurt the most in terms of like what would have happened had he stayed healthy that year. Yeah. So I agree that's probably the biggest what if.
What's frustrating is that he, unlike anyone I've ever seen at BYU, Puka Nacua and Luke Staley are close, but nobody was at Taysom's level of just looking like obviously the best athlete and best player in every game they played. And it didn't matter who we played. He looked like the best athlete on the field and just gave BYU a chance. And it just sucks that it was against the dang Aggies of Utah State that he just kept getting hurt. And really, really, like what could have been if he wouldn't have gotten hurt. But some of that was on BYU. One of those was we had him run when he was supposed to kneel it down. We had a terrible offensive line most of those years. When you look at the number of times he ran, it was fairly unsustainable to get through a season. But if magic could have happened and he would have stayed healthy, I think we could have had a real magical season in one of those years.
Yeah, so it was 2014 was the year that was the biggest what if for me. I think on Cougar Board someone posted 2016. 2016 was after he left. 2015 is when he got the Liz Frank injury against Nebraska, and there was kind of some what ifs there as well. But Tanner, I think, did a decent job that season, at least, producing points on offense. But the 2014 season, they're undefeated going into that Utah State game. Wins against UConn at Texas, right? That was the hurdle to 41-7. They beat Houston at home. They beat Virginia. That was the big stiff arm against Virginia. Taysom just had these moments, right, that you just remember against these teams. And then Utah State wasn't a pushover. The thing is, Utah State, and Utah State fans will argue this, I think they were beating BYU when Taysom went out. And so, would Taysom not getting hurt have changed the outcome of that game? I think there's a case to be made that it may not have, but you never know with Taysom. But let's just assume they win that game, right? They lose at overtime the next week to UCF without Taysom. I think it's Christian Stewart, right? It wasn't even Tanner at that time; it was Christian.
Correct.
And then they lose at home against Nevada, and to me that was the most from high to low in one season. That was probably the biggest downfall that we've seen, at least that I've seen in my lifetime. Going undefeated against those teams, Texas being one of them, to then losing at home to Nevada, 35-42. It just felt like the season was lost, and the rest of the season I barely even paid attention, to be honest, Tosh.
Yeah, for sure. It was just he was our Superman, and in a way that BYU has not had many teams like that. He was what made us go and have a chance.
Yeah. The next kind of highest what if, and I'll just kind of go through these real quick. So the next highest, this is more of like an interesting, what could have been Whittingham going to BYU instead of Bronco.
It was close twice. So it depends what one they're talking about. But
the first one, 2005.
Yes. I guess when you say instead of Bronco, the other one would have been instead of Kalani. But I know that both of them were closer than people realize, and especially the 2005. He was going to accept it for like a 24-hour period, but his family talked him out of it. As much as BYU fans can get annoyed by his antics at times, his anger management, his inability to say BYU. I've talked to guys that have played for him, and every one of them gushes about his just ability to coach, his ability to player develop. And I think we would have been – Bronco was a great coach. So was Whittingham. And their resumes, Whittingham's winning. The other side of it is who would have Utah got? That's the bigger thing. And as we've seen – there is a real teeter-totter when it comes to recruiting with those two schools. And so if Whittingham would have came to BYU, I'm a firm believer that Utah would have taken a big downgrade, and then all of a sudden BYU's getting all the in-state recruits. And it really probably should be higher on the what ifs because I think it would have shifted things. And would they have ever made the Pac-10 or became the 12? I think probably not. Really, in heaven, maybe we can simulate these what ifs, and it would be really interesting to see if Whittingham went to BYU, what would have happened.
Just enter the multiverse and find the scenario where he does go to BYU. I think you're probably I don't think you're giving Utah enough credit. They had just come off of some pretty impressive years with Urban Meyer, and they had a lot of success. I think they could have found a guy from the Bowling Green type ranks that could have probably continued that success that Urban continued. How many guys
would have came over with Whittingham though? Like you're right. The continuity, it really was best case scenario for Utah that they kept their continuity with their defensive coordinator.
Sure. Yeah. And again, the thing is too, Bronco, I think had success. It wasn't that Bronco, that Whittingham would have been a massive upgrade over Bronco.
Correct.
Bronco just plateaued, right? He had early success and then he just kind of plateaued. And I think part of it was, the independence, and they just couldn't, without a P5 schedule, without P5 money, and without P5 exposure. I think Bronco did what he could with that team, and so I don't know if Whittingham, within the same situation, would have led BYU to a Pac-12 invitation, or to P4 invitation in general, or even a BCS bowl game, or whatever, a playoff appearance or conference championship. Everything he did at Utah, I don't think he's accomplishing the same thing at BYU, because the situation is just different at BYU, where the ceiling was a lot lower. So I don't know if the what if there is as extreme as you think, but again, it just kind of depends on who Utah is able to get if Whittingham doesn't stay at Utah, and that's probably the biggest what if is who does Utah get, and if that is a downgrade, and they do start their first 3 seasons with that coach or losing seasons, and they can't recover, then BYU gets all those recruits from Utah. And you're seeing a different situation in the rivalry, at least.
I'm gonna throw 2 basketball ones at you. One is, what if Jabari Parker he had BYU in his top 3? What if he would have chosen BYU instead of Duke?
Yeah, but you and I both know that BYU was not in his actual top 3, right? Duke was number 1 and only from the beginning.
Correct, but what if we would have found some dollars to throw at that guy? What if?
Here's how I would frame this. What if Jabari Parker was in high school now, right? When There's NIL money now,
yeah,
and he comes to BYU.
That team had Hawes, Carlino, Kyle Collinsworth, Mika, Winder, Halford. They were a 23-win team without him. And, they made the NCAA tournament. That one, they could have been, he would have been one and done. Mm-hmm. I also think it would have been better. He would still be more of a living legend. Right now, he's like a disappointment at Duke. He had a great year there, but they have had so many incredible basketball players that his NBA lack of success, they don't talk about him as one of the greats. If he went to BYU and had the season that he was capable of, he would still be much more of a legend, I think, because of how elevated he would be in BYU fans' minds.
It's interesting you say that, because Duke does seem to elevate their legend status to whether or not that player had a good NBA career. At
Correct.
BYU, we care, but we don't really care, right? Because I don't think there's really been a guy from BYU that's had,
Danny Ainge,
right? And Sean Bradley had some seasons in the NBA, but there's not really, So I think we look at Jimmer, Jimmer's a guy that flamed out in the NBA, and we still consider him a legend.
Correct.
Jabari would have fit that same mold, even without a successful NBA career, and he still probably would have had one of the most successful, even even at the rate that he had, with Duke, his time in the NBA was looked down on by Duke fans. By BYU fans, it would have still been one of the best NBA careers of any former BYU player.
Totally. So here's my other one, which is less far-fetched. But if Eric Mika wouldn't have gone pro after his sophomore year, that, he didn't get drafted. He just went and played in Italy for okay money. Again, if this was the current NIL era, he would not have left. Like, he would have got paid way more now than he made in Europe. He still likes BYU. He was at the Denver NCAA tournament game this year supporting BYU. I saw him in the hall. But that year that he left, if he would have stayed, that team had Elijah Bryant, had Yoli Childs, it had Hawes, it had a sophomore Celius. Again, a 24-win team, what made the tournament. He was turning into a legit one of the best centers in college. And like we could have challenged winning the WCC at a different level. He had 2 more years of eligibility. Like that is another basketball in recent times. What if him leaving after his sophomore year was an interesting move. It made more sense at the time, but BYU basketball could have had 2 great years, in my opinion, if he would have stayed.
Agree. I will say, though, if he stays, does Yoli have the same kind of meteoric rise that he had his junior and senior year at BYU? I think he in 2018, he's kind of taken a back seat to Eric, and so maybe he's not as impactful. And then 2019, maybe that trajectory is a little bit lower. But definitely, like I don't think that's a reason why you wouldn't want Eric Mika to stay. As you said, he was one of the best centers in the country, or at least poised to be one of the best centers in the country. So for sure, BYU fans would have wanted him, and he would have made that team better.
So, those are my 2 basketball ones. You gave this last football season gave us some real stuff there. So let's hear those from you.
Yeah, I had 2 just from this last year, and they still live rent-free in my head, and probably in most BYU fans' head. That freaking pooch punt against Kansas, man, it's like a nightmare, a recurring nightmare every night for me. Because it's just the situation, right? If BYU recovers that, even if it's just like a pooch punt, so 2 things happen, right? It was the pooch punt bounces off Evan Johnson's shoulder. If it touches Kansas's player, the Kansas receiver, before it hits Evan Johnson, then it's just a dead ball, right where he touches it. And it doesn't matter that Evan Johnson touched it. But because Evan Johnson touched it first, it just so happened to land on the shoulder. It becomes a live ball, a muffed punt. But even then, Jacob Robinson was the only player within 10 yards of the ball. He could have picked it up and probably run for 30 yards downfield with it. I mean, granted, he doesn't
know there's someone not right behind him, but I agree.
Totally.
And he's one of our. If you had to pick a defender to have a chance at that ball, it's probably him.
He's got the surest hands.
He's one of our best athletes, ball hawks, best ball skills. Let's have him do it. And
if you actually look at the play too, he's the first one to see the ball punted, right? Like Evan Johnson doesn't even know that the ball's punted. He's just covering his receiver. He's covering the guy he's supposed to cover. Jacob Robinson looks up, he sees it, he points to where the ball is going to go. He knows where it's going to go, right? He's pointing at it. He's the first one to the ball by a mile and can't jump on it. And not only does he not jump on it, he basically the ball squeezes out and right in front of Kansas's receiver, and they recovered at the 2. And man, that's my biggest what if, at least of the last couple of years. Yeah, because if he lands on that ball, BYU beats Kansas, and the Arizona State game just doesn't matter at that point. They're in the conference championship game, and anything could happen at that point. And maybe they're in the college football playoffs instead of.
There's also in that same game that terrible fade pass. It wasn't even a real fade, but those are the 2. Either of those don't happen, and BYU wins that game. But the punt was more fluky. And so it is a bigger what if.
Yeah, to me that's more bad plays happen, right? Like especially with Jake, right? We've seen Jake make bad decisions. We just have to kind of live with those. But it's just like it was so out of BYU's control, other than Jacob just landing on the ball. Like BYU, they had it, right? They just land on the ball. It would have gone a different way. And then the second one for me was that Chase Roberts Hail Mary catch, which is so funny because it almost was like an afterthought in the game because of how the game ended with fans. I think were storming the field. They had to get him off the field. And like the last play just seemed very, like, let's just get it out of the way type of thing. Like, they're at midfield. There's less than a second left or less than 5 seconds left. And they're just going to try a Hail Mary and whatever happens, and we'll storm the field again. And not only that, but then I think initially they ruled it an incomplete pass. So like nobody really realized like how close BYU was to actually winning that game. It literally came down to, I think, a couple of yards, right? And he's stretching for the pylon.
Yeah, I thought it was close. You have in the notes here that he was 3 yards away. In my memory, he was even closer than that. But
I just guessed. Yeah, I guessed.
But even still, yeah, like he came down with that ball. So maybe if Jake would have had the ability to throw it to there, maybe it still happens. And so, man, like what an ending that would have been after a disastrous first half.
Yeah. So those are my 2 what ifs from last season. The only probably the biggest other what if that was part of this Cougar Board post was if BYU beats Coastal Carolina, what happens? Does that actually BYU finishes undefeated? They're obviously making the New Year's Six game. Do they make a playoff? That's probably a big question mark. But even just finishing undefeated, and not only that, but like Coastal Carolina was just not, for an undefeated non-P5 school, they weren't that good.
No,
I think BYU had the chance to play better teams, and they just never did that season. And so there was a lot to be desired.
And we should have won. We should have won that game. There was some fluky stuff, like we had a called back touchdown on a
Rex
phantom, on a really phantom hold call. There was a lot of things that could have been called with them roughing up Wilson. Like there was some real weird stuff in that game too. We didn't play great either. We had our running back run 20 yards backwards, and there was just some real stupid stuff.
I hated it. And you could tell BYU just didn't play to their potential because they started practicing and prepping for Coastal on Wednesday. So like, anyway, it was just, granted Coastal was, they weren't really prepared to play BYU either. It just looked like a sloppy game. And again, if BYU wins that game, they're playing against a much better opponent at the end of the season for their bowl game. And you would finally get to see BYU's potential, because that was COVID, right? They didn't really play anybody. And their bowl game, they didn't really play anybody. So, it just, I would have wanted to see BYU and Zach Wilson play against, a decent P5 school that could have, the BYU could have actually made a statement against, but instead they had a dud against Coastal Carolina and finished off the season, as good as they could have considering who they were playing. Okay, Tosh, thanks for hopping on. This is the Loyal Cougars podcast. I'm your host, Jake Edmonds, alongside Tosh Mackintosh. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts, as we keep this thing rolling. We'll see you next week.